The next thing is our panel session, like I said. We've got our panel chair, Dr. Tim Clune, who's a senior lecturer in management and human resources in the agribusiness area of La Trobe University. Sorry, I am not an academic. So welcome, Tim, and he will introduce our panellists. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's a fantastic introduction to talk about action, which is what we want to talk about. I'd like to introduce Carolyn Welsh, Nina O'Brien and Damian Wells, who are going to be our three speakers this morning. They'll come up independently. They'll speak one after another. We'll have a question to the panel. Then we'll take a question from the room. Then we'll take a question online, and then we'll have a closing session. If you look at your program, you can see we're already crunching up and we'll be still here at 10 o'clock tonight, and we don't want to do that sort of thing. I think it's a fantastic introduction. I'm really pleased to see some opinion put on the table, particularly when it's informed opinion. But I want us to talk about actions for the next little while. And so I'll start with bringing up Carolyn Welsh to have a discussion. Carolyn grew up in Bayside, Melbourne. Inspired by her farming grandparents to study agricultural science. Her first job in regional Victoria was a cuber operator for High Cube Industries in Bort. She worked in irrigated horticulture in Swan Hill for 19 years. She had a Churchill Fellowship in 1998 to investigate markets competitors of Australia's fresh stone fruit exports. Carolyn was a director of Birchip Cropping Group for 14 years. What a great link to our Drought Hub, Birchip Cropping Group being such an essential partner for us. Carolyn's a partner in the family grain company. She's deputy chair of GWMWater. The last few years have seen Carolyn expand her roles with government as a member of Consultative Committee Hub's Advisory Committee in the federal $5 billion Future Drought Fund and the Agriculture Victoria Climate Change Council. Fantastic. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks very much, Tim, and I must admit, driving down here, made me realise I perhaps should have put on that I've got a graduate diploma from La Trobe University, Bendigo. It seems a very long time ago. But yeah, really happy to be talking today. One other thing, I'll just do a quick plug. You mentioned my Churchill Fellowship. Churchill Fellowships are open at the moment, and the closing date's in early May, if anyone wants to go online and have a look at that. But I'm here with my hat today talking about water and drought resilience, and I'll just quickly give you a bit of an overview of Grampians Wimmera Water. That's our region, very much the western part of the state. We cover about 25% of Victoria. If you have a look at that map, the yellow-green area is pretty well on the right-hand side. This is very generally speaking. We're traditionally fed through a channel system. The pink and blue on the left are groundwater sources for water. So Grampians Wimmera Water, we're a government-based organisation, and we manage storage, headworks, provide water to urban and rural customers, and we also manage wastewater. So we kind of do the whole lot across our region. And there has been a lot of changes in recent times. I won't go over this. I think Bob's covered it pretty well. Unfortunately, for those of us who live in the northwest and the western part of Victoria, we're the parts of the state that are going to be impacted most by climate change, and certainly have been feeling that already. I married into the family farm in 2000, so my introduction to dryland farming was very much around the millennial drought for the first 10 years. But this graph, and I'll take a bit of time to go through it because it's really busy, obviously, but it's all about the inflows into our storages. Most of the water that Grampians Wimmera Water deals with comes from the Grampians systems and the Grampians area. And this is very much about the inflows that our region's experienced since 1951. So if you have a look at the horizontal green line, that's basically 200 gigalitres of water that we would expect that we've experienced as an average over the since 1951. About 200 gigalitres of water we've received. If you look at the middle section and that orange horizontal line, That's the change that was experienced between 1951 and 1975, and we really saw quite a step change in the reduction of the amount of water that flows into our stream flows. Bob didn't talk much about rainfall, but I think we all know that with climate change, the expectations is certainly in our region that we'll get less rainfall. And if you've got a certain percentage of a decline in rainfall, you can expect that the percentage change to stream inflows is much, much higher. So reduced rainfall means even more reduced inflows, unfortunately. And then if you move across to the horizontal line on the right-hand side, the red one, which says minus 58%, well, that's what we've experienced since 1997. So we've kind of got, our long-term 200 gigalitres is kind of what we'd expect to receive, and in the last, since 1997 period, we're actually getting only about 85 gigalitres of inflow into our region. And from our farm, that probably means that we had the millennial drought. Since the millennial drought, we've had a couple of wet years, but really we haven't really ever got back to the stream flows or the rainfall that we experienced prior to that 1997 period. Thankfully, water authorities, we're pretty good at planning, we're pretty good at, we've been very good at getting some government funding and assistance, and what we've done is piped a lot of our systems as much as we possibly can. This is a list of the pipelines that we've put in place since the early 90s. As I said, a lot of that eastern part of our region, we used to get a channel delivery once a year. Water would arrive from an open channel system all the way from the Grampians, almost all the way up to the Murray River, which was obviously hugely inefficient. We piped the northern part of that area in the early years, and then we had a huge program during the millennial drought, which was the Wimmera-Mallee pipeline, and that saved 103 gigalitres of water. One of the good things about having a really inefficient system, like an open channel system that runs for miles and miles, is that you can save a lot of water. And then since then, we've sold off some irrigation water as well. So that's what's kind of happened within our traditional footprint, and it has led to huge efficiencies and improvements. And it's also made pretty big changes to people who are receiving water on farm. Rather than just, a big dam fill once a year, all of a sudden we get year-long water availability, which really changes how we can manage our farms. We get a much higher quality of water. We used to source our water from a range of different options. Grampians water is really high quality, and it's a very reliable supply now that it's from pipes. One of the challenges with that is that we used to have on-farm dams. People on farms, the importance of having on-farm dams, it might just be for yabbing, it might be for playing with the kids, biodiversity. That was a real change to our system and to our understanding, and I think it took people a lot of time to really understand what that meant. One of the challenges also with converting to a pipeline is that we now we thought, we're getting water every day, we don't, it's fine. But part of the agreement was that we actually have to have 3 days of water on farm so that they can make changes and fix pipes and things like that. And that seems very straightforward. Yep, fair enough, we're getting a pipe system, 3 days water on farm. But the mindset and the change of having a once-off channel supply system to a piped system means that all of a sudden, 1 minute we're kind of in the middle of the millennial drought. We've sold all our stock off because we didn't want to cart water, we didn't have much water for stock, and now all of a sudden we've got a much better source of water. It's reliable, it's high quality. The number of stock in the Mallee and the Wimmera has gone up again. We've seen more increased intensive farming in the region as well. So maybe what 3 days of water supply looked like in 2010 when we were all, only had 200 sheep left, now we've got thousands. That understanding of how to manage that watering system on farm has taken a while for people to get to understand and to really recognise how to manage it. We did have, with the huge amount of water that we saved with the Wimmera-Mallee pipeline, we also had opportunity for growth water. We had 20 gigalitres of water that we were able to put aside for expansion development within our region, and that's been really important for what's happened since then, which I'll go into in a minute. As I said, the loss of on-farm dams was a really big issue for a lot of farms, and also a big issue for biodiversity, because you've got a pretty dry area, and we used to have dams all over our farms. But one of the discussions that happened with the Wimmera Mallee pipeline within the community was, well, what's that going to mean? And what's it also going to mean for our recreation lakes? If you have a look at a map of the Wimmera Mallee area, for such a dry area, there's a lot of lakes. And for our community, those lakes have become even more important now that we no longer have on-farm dams. And there's been some work that's been done about the community impact, the dollar value of having recreational lakes in our small and regional towns across Wimmera Mallee, and they just make a huge difference. And one of the interesting things was with the Wimmera Mallee pipeline, very focused on pipes, we actually got our customers said, we want our lakes, we want as many recreational lakes as we can, and so we put in place a recreation levy. So every farmer, every individual residential customer pays a little fee to ensure that we can keep our recreational lakes in our region. And that's something that the state government's actually starting to roll out across. That sort of emphasis on recreational lakes is something that's been sort of transferred across the rest of the state. A big change also during that time was environmental water, and GWMWater, we're responsible for delivering a lot of environmental water through our region, but it's decided by the environmental water holder. And in recent years, there's been much more emphasis on cultural water. The state government's really interested in seeing how we can work with our Aboriginal and Indigenous communities to work out how we can give them some autonomy and some commercial opportunities about using water. And they obviously have a really close relationship with land, but also with water. And that's something that we'll be working a lot more in future years. All of these decisions that we have come to with about pipelines are also with the background knowledge that we know as Grampians Wimmera Mallee Water, that not only are we in one of the areas of the state with quite a low socioeconomic community, we're also one of the highest, we have one of the highest charging rates for our water. A lot of which is to do with, big area to cover, small population, as you can understand, but all of our decisions are with that sort of focus. So any development that we do, it's very much about making sure that that's not impacting on our current customer base and their costs. Since we've put the Wimmera Mallee pipeline in place, in particular, that's kind of covered, our dry area of the Wimmera Mallee. But what we've found is that all of a sudden communities on our border are saying, oh, well, when you put that pipeline in place, well, we didn't really need that because it rains where we live, our dams fill, we're fine. And then all of a sudden in the mid-2010s, some of those areas were getting a bit sick of having to cart water for their dams because they've found that they've had a real step change in their rainfall. So we've now since then done a whole range of different extensions to our pipeline and our region that our pipeline is covering, using some of that 20 gigalitres of growth water, is just expanding. We've done a whole range, and we've also got 2 new pipelines sort of in the pipeline, so to speak, and we expect that demand for pipelines is going to increase as people are really seeing changes to their on-farm rainfall. I just wanted to quickly highlight that I know the regional drought. One of the programs within the Future Drought Fund is the development of regional drought resilience plans, and they're coming out. I think the Wimmera Southern Mallee one's going to be released either next month or very soon, and it did identify pipeline extensions as the #1 infrastructure priority for drought resilience. So even though on farm we make decisions every day, certainly at a regional level in terms of responding to climate change and managing the challenges we have related to that. That's why I've concentrated so much on pipelines, because it really has made a huge difference, and it was great to see what Bob spoke about in terms of some of the regional examples that he gave about water infrastructure. being so key to the way we can really tackle climate change in the future. That's it. Thank you.
I think that's a really great start in terms of thinking about changes that we make really with one group of end users in mind that have much broader consequences. And when we're talking about community outcomes, we need to recognise that, you know, we talk a lot about drought and farmers, but farmers don't exist in a bubble. They exist as part of a community, and so what happens necessarily on farm necessarily impacts communities, which is a great lead into our next speaker, Nina O'Brien from Rural and Regional Recovery. So Nina's passionate about advocating for the people that call regional Australia home and making their communities great places to live. Her bio says she was raised in Mallee Scrub in Western South Australia, and her skills in strategic thinking, project management, governance, communication and community engagement position her well to lead disaster resilience and recovery at FRRR. Nina's recently taken on the challenge of studying an MBA and holds a Bachelor of Arts, Graduate Diploma of Community Sector Management and Certificates in Governance and Training and Assessment. She has previously worked for not-for-profit community services, regional arts development and local government in South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria. And in her spare time, Nina is a practising artist and also volunteers in Echuca Moama community. Nina, welcome.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to the previous speakers. It certainly has a lot of synergy with what we're seeing at FRRR. Just make sure these clickers are working okay. So thank you, and it's fantastic to be here this morning. I also echo the sentiments of the fantastic welcome to acknowledgement of country that we had this morning, and acknowledge the deep wisdom that our First Nations communities convey to us, and I feel like we still have a lot to learn, particularly with their deep understanding of connection to country with people. So just a quick snapshot of the foundation. We work nationally right across Australia. We have a really strong national resilience agenda, and we work across 3 strategic portfolio areas of people, place and disaster resilience and climate solutions. And really broadly, we work to a vibrant, resilient and revitalised rural, regional and remote Australia. We have a particular strategic focus on better meeting the needs of remote and very remote communities, and particularly First Nations communities as well. We've been operating for around 22 years now, so we've been around for a while. We're established right back in the early 2000s and have gradually evolved over that time to just this is quick figures in terms of who we've supported just in the last 12 months, around $20 million worth of investment directed to small, not-for-profit, community-based organisations in remote, rural and regional Australia. To draw a context to our conversation today, 62% of that investment, so around 12 million, is related to disaster, so really significant weighting. It gives you a quick snapshot of just the significant impacts that regional rural communities are experiencing and the demand that they're seeking, financial support and assistance from us to do so. We fund a whole range of really interesting and diverse things with those community-based organisations. You can see that that's this rough sort of 25% split across building organisational capacity, providing access to services and activities, awareness, knowledge and skills, and a really important part of what we do, particularly with regard to climate preparedness in particular, is investing in infrastructure and equipment as communities grapple what a future might look like for them. If we zoom into Victoria, 26% of this investment, or 260 odd projects, and that's just last year. So really significant. One of the things that we pay active attention to is we work right across the disaster cycle, but with a particular focus on medium to long-term recovery and preparedness. We believe that the immediate response phase is a really busy space, and it's primarily the role of government, and we're very strategically clear that we only work in that space by exception, and we start to work with communities, generally around the 18 months after a significant climatic event. That, of course, is slightly different context when we're talking about drought. What we are really proud of is that the balance of our investment across the disaster cycle, while recovery is still a really significant focus, 45% is directed to preparedness, and this is a figure that we're really wanting to drive and increase over time. That's a stark contrast to, some of the national government figures that have been bandied around, post 1920 bushfires, where the ratio was 97% in recovery. In recovery. Far less in preparedness, and I'm sure that's shifted since that time. But it's something that's a really good, active national conversation to have. As I said, we work right across the disaster spectrum. We focus on that medium to long term, and when we say medium to long term, we mean 2 to 10 to 15-ish years. This is also, I feel like, an evolving space in terms of when we say long-term recovery. What do we actually mean by that? If government says that, I think they mean 2 to 3, and we well recognise and have known all along that recovery is a long and slow process, and that's particularly pertinent to drought recovery. What informs our thinking is we've had a long association with communities in drought right across our 22 years of establishment. We've supported around 420 odd projects through our Tackling Tough Times Together program, particularly in response to the 18, 19, 20-ish drought. And that's provided us with a deep insight of the types of supports that communities are requiring in an in-drought context. We're incredibly pleased and excited to shift that gaze to a preparedness focus and become involved in the Future Drought Fund's Networks to Build Drought Resilience, which has resulted in a further 86 projects, which was just wrapped up in the last month or two. And we're now moving into and mid-flight, and I acknowledge the organisations in the room that we're working alongside with our Helping Regional Communities Prepare for Drought, which is a parallel investment to the innovation hubs and the other streams of support through the FGF. That's around a $30 million investment to work at a grassroots community level and echo those thoughts around absolutely about working from a ground up, not top down approach. So, when we talk to people, a lot of things, what does this actually look like in a community? Like, give me an example of that. We sit squarely on the spectrum of things that are practical and what make a difference to people and communities on a day-to-day basis. One of those projects that we've supported in the Networks program is a fantastic country halls project that's across Cornish Town, Stanley and Sandy Creek, so just sort of up the way from here. So that was not only upgrading their halls with IT infrastructure, it was actually providing opportunities for farmers to come together across the diversity of the Indigo Shire footprint to start to have those conversations and to encourage collaborations with peer organisations like Riverine Plains and so forth to bring people together and draw those linkages. So it's a fantastic opportunity and really good, simple, practical example of what works. So a quick snapshot of our Helping Regional Communities Prepare for Drought. This is a $30 million investment that we started last July. We're partnering with the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation to deliver a multi-faceted initiative that includes a whole range of things, ranging from large grants to community-based organisations in 35 regions. That'll range up to $500,000. Mentoring and leadership with the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. We'll be working alongside those community partners as well. We also have small networks grants that can activate just hyper simple small community initiatives as well. What we've been excited about with this particular approach is moving away from that really traditional transactional granting approach that so many governments and funders are taking and implementing a co-design and multi-step process with communities. So while it takes longer and it's more involved, we're very much about encouraging collaboration, not competition. And that's been quite a significant step change in people's attitudes with access to granting at a community level in a really positive way, but that too takes time. But we're really pleased to say that we're just about to, we have a program advisory committee next Friday to determine the first set of regions that will be announced for that process as we move through. So that support will be continuing between now and the end of June 2025. So that's a practical snapshot. From a theoretical perspective, we've been working alongside the University of Sydney for about 5 years now to understand what constructs and inputs actually really help or hinder communities with regard to preparedness. What we've found through observation and working in communities, both in New South Wales, currently in Victoria, and now expanding into Queensland, is that there are a range of community critical dimensions that it's important to pay attention to and to direct investment to over time. They're critical things like communities having access to and building skills and capacity to play a part in decision making. It's around building their communication skills so they are able to collaborate with their peers on a local level. Sometimes it's just about practical things like resources, tools and support. It's also recognising and investing in self-organising systems. So often particularly in a disaster or a climatic impact event, that it's those silent self-organising systems that we so deeply rely on, but it's never recognised, or you'd never find that on a website, for instance, in any particular community. Sometimes it's about awareness raising and access to information. People, you don't know what you don't know, and so part of this role is absolutely about working alongside communities in a really respectful way to share information and build their knowledge over time. And that's where I think we start to see that gradual attitudinal change that you've touched on this morning, which is really important. Networks are really critical. Being socially connected, the work of Daniel Aldrich is really interesting when we're talking about the connection between social networks but social infrastructure as well. It's really interesting work to dive into if you're interested. So connection around, if we're talking about recreational lakes, the importance of that to social capital is really, really interesting. Parks and other social infrastructure is really important. Community halls, critical to the people, but also the infrastructure as well. The resilience, thank you. The resilience dimensions are available on the FRRR website if you're interested. There's a short and long form. So if we bundle all of that up, what does adaptation look like with increasing hot days and the likelihood of drought in this region? And when I say this region, I do live locally. I just live north of the border, and so, bring to this work a really deeply lived experience of what drought looks like and the manifestations that it has in communities. We believe that an increased investment in building capacity and capability of local community organisations is really critical. It's not always just about projects. They certainly help and play and have their role, but it's about investing in the organisations themselves and in their internal capacity and capability building. Certainly within philanthropic circles, this is certainly floating to the surface as something really important, and it's something that we're investing in Victorian bushfire communities in particular, that we're trialling with a much longer form of granting as well. We believe that strength in skills, knowledge, connection and networks, like I've touched on, those social ties in local people really increase personal and collective awareness of climatic risk. You can certainly read interesting stuff on a website, but it's much more meaningful if you can connect with local peer community members and collectively, discuss, well, what does this actually mean for us? Do we agree with that data? How does that match our local anecdotal knowledge? That type of thing. We believe that sharing information and opportunities and working collectively is really important, but also being clear about our role and that of others. We strongly believe in, the value of collaboration and far less about competition. And it's certainly some of those good but challenging conversations we've had with some of our regions that are coming through the HRCPD program at the moment in terms of, who are your collaborators, who is sitting at the table, or more importantly, who's not at the table? Who are those silent voices in your community that we know that are impacted by drought, but we're just not hearing from? So often young people, so often First Nations communities are not represented in these community conversations. So we're having those really good and healthy, challenging conversations with regions at the moment. We strongly believe about taking active steps to include people who are impacted beyond the farm gate. So often when we talk about drought, it's focused on farms and farming families, and that's certainly really important. But if you've ever lived in a small, particularly regional community, you well know that the impacts of drought go well beyond the farm gate. One thing that we're really diving into and will continue into the future too is climate smart community facilities, particularly with regard to heat and successive hot days set to increase. We so often talk about floods or droughts or fire, but far less so about increasing number of days over 35 and increasing impacts that will have. As grant makers, we're also really challenging ourselves to grant smarter and grant in a more agile way to communities through those co-design and multi-stage processes and ways of working that we're talking about, and certainly working in more collaboration with universities, local government, other community partners to leverage investment both in kind and in cash. So that's just a few thoughts. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks, Tim.
No, thanks, Nina. That was a really interesting conceptualisation of putting cash in individuals and small groups' hands. But sometimes individuals and small groups can't do what needs to be done, which is why our third speaker is of interest. Our third speaker is Damian Wells. He's the MD of Coliban Water. And he's going to talk to you about some experiences that they've had working with communities to deliver that next level sort of outcome. So Damian's currently the Managing Director of Coliban Water. His career has included work in technical and leadership roles in water, environment and regulation. After early career technical roles in catchment management and water, Damian held operational leadership role at Goulburn Water before being appointed CEO of North Central Catchment Management Authority in 2008. In 2015, Damian was appointed Executive Director at Environment Protection Authority Victoria, where he led statewide regulatory operations. Damian also has over 10 years' experience as a non-executive director, having previously served on the board of Anglicare Victoria and its predecessor organisations. He's a non-executive director of Zero Emissions Water and is a great friend and chair of the Trobe Bendigo Advisory Board. So Damian, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. G'day, everyone. I can sense we need to fire up a bit in the room. I think I'm between you and a coffee, or the panel is at least. Look, thanks for having me. When you're in a leadership role where your job is to ensure that the community doesn't run out of water for drinking water purposes in the next drought, it really does sharpen your mind about the kind of decisions that need to be made in a timely way. Where do I point that thing? This is the Coliban Water region, central and northern Victoria. We start at the top of the Great Dividing Range, and you think about Trentham, Kyneton, Castlemaine, Bendigo, Rochester, Echuca, up to River Murray, Heathcote to the east, and a lot of small towns. So 49 towns altogether. The shaded areas, actually before I get to the shaded areas, what is the business of a water corporation? Now, this might seem really obvious, but we've put a fair bit of work into this. It's about providing safe drinking water, recycled water, sewage and rural water services for public health. We are public health businesses. That's what we do. Safe drinking water and sanitation services for the community so that they can sustain themselves. We've got 4 traditional owner groups in the region that we serve, so Jara, Tangerang, Yorta and Barappa. Caroline's covered this really well, the step change in water availability in our region and how that has dramatically changed over time. And clearly the step change off the back of the Millennium Drought is really stark. So I think Caroline's figure is a little bit more impressive than mine, but 53% is still a shitload of water you don't have. If you think about that red line, this is at the upper Coliban storages. These are the storages around Kyneton, and these are the storages that Bendigo has long relied on. Now, someone in the room called David Downey, who's over here, and when you talk about being at the pointy end of policy, David actually, through the Millennium Drought, leveraged several $1 billion worth of investment into drought response, and we are now better positioned for the next drought off the back of the policy work that David did to galvanise the government around the Millennium Drought response here in Victoria. So, as Caroline said, and I do need to reiterate it, you might say a 10 or 15% reduction in rainfall. In many cases, that could be a 40+% reduction in inflows to storages. So next 5 years of Coliban Water. So we're regulated by the Essential Services Commission. Now, if you think about regulation, you think about utility prices, if you're like me, you've probably just got a letter from your energy or your gas provider saying that your bill's going up 27 or 37 or something percent this year. We are proposing a 1.9% price increase for Coliban Water customers. We have to front up to some very significant issues to continue to service our community, and they are climate change, population growth and ageing assets. We have kicked the can down the road for far too long. We need to renew our assets. So if you think about, are we at this nice, strong, resilient asset base now that we can now launch into climate resilience? Well, actually, no, we're not. We're behind the 8 ball. We need to renew the assets that we have now, thinking about water reclamation plants, water treatment plants, thinking about our networks, thinking about our clear water storages in our networks, thinking about heat health in Bendigo, for example, where in the hot weather, mortality rates go up 18% in Bendigo. So what's our role in heat health risk for community? And there is no question we need to invest. Now, little old Coliban Water, we already have $440 million of debt. Now, that might have your jaw hit the desk, but we're proposing to increase that debt further to make these investments. Who's paying for that debt? Coliban Water customers. We're 100% customer funded. So through Coliban Water bills, about $350 of every Coliban Water customer bill contributes to paying that debt. Now, you might think that sounds crazy, but there's actually some logic to it, which is that over the life of an asset, which may last 50 years, 80 years, 100 years, everybody who benefits from that asset over time should reasonably pay a share in the cost of that asset. So that's what underpins the thinking in terms of the Essential Services Commission model. We're proposing to triple our capital program over the next 5 years, about $150 million over the last 5 years. We're proposing $435 million over the next 5 years. It's a big, ambitious program, but it's absolutely necessary. In many ways, there is no choice. We must make these investments because our communities absolutely depend on us. We've got $2 billion worth of assets. We've got a lot to do in terms of our water security. I won't go into too much detail there, other than to say you're not getting a letter from your gas and your electricity providers that gives you certainty over the next 5 years for your water prices. And that's what we're offering in terms of our customers. Now, we didn't come up with this in a vacuum. We ran a full 5 Saturdays of work, a fully recruited through a whole stratification process of a deliberative panel. The community panel actually told us this. In fact, the community panel said that we should put the prices up a little bit more than what we're proposing. Now, the other thing that the community panel said is we don't want you to leave anyone behind. So we're also doubling our hardship program, or our Coliban Assist program. So we will be putting in the order of $500,000 a year into that program to support parts of our community who will struggle with bills. Now, What are you doing about water security? You ask the local water corporation, well, heaps of stuff. And there's heaps of stuff that isn't always visible. And I think some people may sit out there sometimes thinking, these idiots, they can't think of anything. They're not thinking about this, not thinking about that. Well, we've got some pretty sharp minds in the water sector who are thinking about a lot of things. So clearly education is a big piece. Yes, we need to purchase more water entitlements, and one of the things that David was involved with is building the Goldfields Super Pipe, which connects Bendigo and Ballarat to the Coliban system so that you can bring water across. Bendigo was within 5 weeks of running out of water in the Millennium Drought. You think about that, a big provincial city within 5 weeks of running out of drinking water for its community. It is unbelievable when you pause and think about how close Bendigo came to running out of water. We've got to do heaps more on recycled water. There will have to be a debate around potable recycled water, what the sector calls purified recycled water. We obviously have to get on top of our leakage. We've got a small rural system. We think we can save about 6 gigalitres of water by modernising that. That's probably about $130 million investment that's required, and we're looking to do a detailed business case on that with the federal government as a partner at the moment. I mentioned treated water storage. That's about drinking water closer to your customers, more resilient networks. Integrated water management, that's partnering with local government, planners, everybody to think about how we can manage better the rainfall that we do get, how it works through the community, the blue and green stuff that Rob was talking about. Groundwater will be part of the picture. Those who adapt successfully to climate change will have unbelievable understanding of their local context. Every single town, we have a town vision for every single town. We know what the water sources could be to support that town. We understand the supply and demand curve. We're seeking to work with local government to influence settlement patterns. Where the water's just not going to be there, we're talking with local governments about what their future growth might be in our region. Managed aquifer recharge. When it's wet, what water can you grab and actually re-inject into groundwater aquifers and pull that out at a later date when you need it? And it's not new, it's done all around the world, it's done in Perth. I mentioned regional growth. We've got digital meters. We will nearly have about a 95% penetration across the whole Coliban water customer base with digital meters within the next 18 months. That means that everybody at the household level, their water is being measured about once a minute or so in terms of use. We already, where those digital meters exist, we already have our contact centre staff ringing people to say, hey, you've got a spike in your water use, we can see it, have a look around. And people are finding leaks, people are finding their kids went out the side of the house and turned on a tap and walked away. People are finding all kinds of things, and ultimately we'll have a graphic user interface available on an app to put the power in people's hands on that. And obviously this connectivity issue, grid, how do we make sure that we can draw on water from a whole bunch of different sources when we need to. So we have to be in front of it. We don't want to be in that 5-week position again. We just experienced some of the biggest floods in living memory in this region, and that was heavy and that was tough. And there were some fantastic resilience investments that happened after the 2011 floods, which paid dividends in the 2022 October flooding. And I think there's some instructive lessons there about how you can get ahead of it. The thing I would just leave you with is, if you think about the big capital projects that are required to be successful in large-scale adaptation for community benefit, our approvals processes don't match. You're going to run out of water before you've built the thing because you couldn't get it approved. So I don't say that facetiously. I think we need to mainstream climate adaptation projects as having a smoother approvals pathway so that we can serve our communities, because our communities will not thank us when we aren't ahead of it because we didn't get the project approved in time. I'll stop there. I rant a bit, sorry.
No, thanks for that, Damian. I think that was a really useful overview of some of the local issues that a place like Bendigo can face without adaptation. Because of where we are, and where everyone's coffee level is going to be. I'm going to take one question from the room, I'm going to take one from online, and I'm going to have a closer with the panel, if you'll indulge me. And the first hand went up over there. Andrew's got a microphone for you.
My name's Beth Jabornik, and I'm from Stuart Mill, near St Arnaud, and I'm here because we're one of the communities that's been left behind. And we've started up the Upper Teddington Action Group, and we're fascinated to hear all your stories today. It's great. But I suppose my question is, who's looking at these communities with very low socio-economic levels, places like Stawell and St Arnaud, and who's going to help us? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Who from the panel would like to pick on Stawell?
Well, I don't want to pick on Stawell, but it's certainly in our region, and I know that there's been a number of people from GWMWater have been talking to people from Stuart Mill and about the Teddington Reservoir, which, as I think Damian alluded to earlier, one of the challenges with water is that there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and there are a lot of policy makers or potential decision makers who have a say or who are involved in how decisions around water are made. For example, when pipelines are put in place, there's a whole range of planning that's required, but certainly with GWMWater, we always start with the community and what the community is asking. I spoke a fair bit about demand for new pipeline expansions, and a lot of that comes specifically from demand from communities because they're seeing their water supplies changing and their climate changing. And I suppose sometimes it's the challenge between we're all trying to modernise. Damian mentioned the digitisation of meters and so on, and that actually changes the way we need to communicate to our customers. We have a huge region, we have a lot of very small communities, and we've had lots of different communities come and talk to us about local reservoirs, local recreation lakes that they may want for recreation, they may want for fishing, they may want for biodiversity, they may just want for amenity values. And as pipelines come on board, one of the challenges with that is not just the loss of on-farm dams, but how many of those potential lakes that were filled through a channel system, for example, in our region, can then be filled within a pipeline system. There's some that have been taken off the delivery side and then become, if they're very shallow and they're very large and they're not efficient, then the way up is, well, how much value is that lake to the community and compared to the loss of water, given that, just for a bit of background, Damian gave a really great sort of summary page of what they're doing with their 5-year pricing submission. One of the key aspects with our pricing submission is, even though we saved 103 gigalitres of water with the Wimmera Mallee pipeline, and we had 20 gigalitres of growth water to play with to expand our region, and a lot of that's gone to new agriculture investments, new mining investments, we're now spending the next 5 years thinking about how we need to augment our system, because we can see, not that we're going to run out of water anytime soon, and we may not, but we can see by 2045 we really need to have a plan for making sure we're using water as efficiently as possible. So even though we've saved all this water and we're so much more efficient than we used to, we can see the future's changing, and we will potentially need to really start thinking about how we're going to get more water into the system or use it even more efficiently than we are now. So that's part of the bigger context of some of those local decisions and conversations we have to have. Yeah. Sorry, and I'll just say, and I hope the conversations with GWMWater are continuing with Stuart Mill. Yeah, it's certainly something that we've been discussing at board level.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for the question. If I just go to the Slido, the point at the top appears to be a comment, so I'll drop past that. I might drop Rob, to a question to you about what's being done to broker work in the regions.
Yeah, I saw that question. I've been pondering how to answer it. Look, ultimately we run a series of relatively small research projects, and we interact with a finite number of farmers within that region, and rely heavily on the partners that have brokered that work to get the message out. And again, some are very good at that, others not so much. We try to get around that a little bit by doing the research through PhDs, so that extends the contact time up to 3 years or more. And these are young, bright people who are super enthusiastic and get out to lots of farmers to talk about the work. But yeah, it's certainly difficult to get to as many people as we would like.
So how might we change that, Rob?
Well, listening to some of the talks here, I think we can make some new connections and reach a lot more people. So I'll be working the room today.
Fantastic. That's the sort of answer that we're looking for. Action right from the word go. Thanks, Rob.
Tim, I think one of the purposes of the community, of the helping regional communities prepare for drought is connecting researchers to the grassroots community-based organisations. So it's, we recognise it's really tricky for universities to actually understand and know where those silent networks and connections exist in regional communities. And so that's sort of one of the purposes that we undertake, is to act as a broker between future drought fund delivery organisations, but also connect them up to community organisations themselves.
I had you in mind when I made that comment.
Well, that's great. You two can catch up at morning tea, which will be shortly, because I've got one question for the entire panel, and that's about lessons learnt. We talked in rapid fire about successful things, and if you just reflect on successful things have been done, as well as some of the things that have been done by your organisations that have been less successful, what would be two key takeaways from each of you? Carolyn, I'll start with you.
I think change in rural communities that is appropriate and most positive for rural communities comes when the people who are making the decisions and have the most input into those decisions live and work locally. I think of some of the really key staff members we have at GWMWater, and they're people who know the communities really well, who've lived there, who've worked there, and also have some autonomy in the decisions they make. So I think it's really important for government and decision makers to make those rural and regional jobs, positions, available long-term, well-funded, so that the job you have in Horsham working for GWMWater is just as well-funded, just as challenging, just as interesting, just as well-supported as any job that you might get at Melbourne Water. And that's particularly the case when, as we know, particularly with engineering type work, there's so much going on in the state at the moment. But I think that autonomy of people who live and work in a region long-term and are well-supported in it, that's when really good decisions are made with the community.
Great insight. Nina?
Similar theme, I'd have to say. Our experience delivering the Networks to Build Drought Resilience program, so our initial investment, they were 12 to 18 months projects. We were dipping our toes in the water with communities right across Australia. So not that it wasn't successful, but outcomes and community benefits are contained or restrained when you're talking about short-term timeframes. So that's how we've tilted our approach to taking this much longer time frame to work with communities, because attitudinal change is slow, rightfully, in regional communities, and so that's what we have been reminded of the benefit of, particularly when communities are dealing with so much other community impacts as well.
I'll make my way across to you, Damian.
Yeah, look, I think for me there's two things that really jump to mind. One is consequence management, and you hear a lot in emergency management. So what is the community consequence of a given event? And if you can really get clear about how the community will experience something, then you can actually think meaningfully about how you can work with that community to support that community in how they respond to that consequence. So consequence thinking around community, and there's a lot of really good stuff on the Emergency Management Victoria website about consequence management. I think that's a big one. The other one is we often look in water resource modelling, and you look at long-term demand and long-term supply, and where do those lines cross? Oh, that's where you're going to run out of water. Now, it's kind of unhelpful, because ultimately I think what's more valuable is scenario planning. So if you think about the bell curve, you've got heaps of stuff in the middle where you're going to have heaps of good years and you're going to get through, job's right. But on the very ends, you've got extreme floods and extreme droughts, which is what happens in southeastern Australia, and it's going to be worse. So I think that's really instructive for us at Coliban Water, thinking through what might those extreme scenarios be, how will they present, what will be the community consequence of those extreme events, and how well are we positioned and how well are the community positioned to respond to mitigating and managing and living through those consequences.
And Rob, as a question without notice, I'll let you in on the in-joke. The other guests knew the answer. I didn't have you on my list. I apologise.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Look, I would give a similar answer to Caroline and Nina in that, especially in recent times during COVID, we've seen a very strained relationship between lay people and experts, and I think that's because of the way that we define what an expert is. And we've made a deliberate strategy to, talk with farmers and other agronomists, natural resource managers within regions and localities, because they're the experts. My PhD doesn't help me to understand what's going on in a particular location. So, that's been a key for us, and why our work is well received generally.
Thanks for those really insightful responses. I appreciate it. Just before I hand back to Sarah, I'd like to express my thanks to Carol and Nina and Damian, and you too, Rob, for the comments that you brought to the table, the examples that we've seen, and really that great summary at the end. It's got to be local, there's got to be some sense of longevity in it, we've got to understand the risk, and you finishing with relationships, Rob, which I think was really powerful. I'd just like everyone to put their hands together, thank our panel to open our start, and we've got a small gift for you. Thank you.